I recently traveled to Capitol Hill to sit down with Representative Mike Gallagher. Mike is a soldier, a scholar, and the head of the House's Select Committee on China.
There's far more than strategic ambiguity.
I wanted to talk to Mike because he's a deep thinker on the two big questions that will decide the fate of the U.S.-China competition. First, how can D.C. focus on China productively? And second, are Congress and the executive branch institutionally set up to compete? In this interview, you'll get the perspective of a key player in Congress on what's broken in Washington and how he hopes change can come. I want to start you off. Speaking of Congress, how broken is the legislative branch?
Incredibly broken. Having written an article in 2017 or 2018 in The Atlantic talking about how broken Congress was as an impetuous freshman, the Speaker of the House at the time, who was from Wisconsin, did not appreciate that article. So the fundamental problem as I see it is that the legislature is weak. It is incredibly weak, right? The framers, if you read the Federalist Papers, feared that the legislature would indeed become the opposite, too strong, that it would suck everything into its impetuous vortex. They could not have foreseen a scenario in which power-hungry and ambitious members of Congress would willingly cede their constitutional authority to the executive branch. So if there is a cancer eating away at our Constitution and the body politic, it's that. It's Congress's systematic surrender of power to the executive branch, which makes government less accountable. You have unelected bureaucrats wielding powers that should be reserved for members of Congress, and I think it makes the American people more disillusioned. Now, what has made that possible? Well, when the Watergate babies came in the 70s, they saw over-empowered and corrupt committee chairs in Congress, and so they sought in a well-intentioned way to clean that up. But practically, they ended up transferring a lot of power to leadership. You had the creation of the steering committee at that time. And then you had a series of legislation, the Emergencies Act, the Budget Impoundment and Control Act, the War Powers Resolution, which again was intended to reclaim congressional power, but indeed did the exact opposite. Republicans take control in the 90s, trying to do the same thing, but practically transfer more power to the Speaker. So right now we've arrived at a moment where power in an increasingly powerless institution is concentrated at the very top, which makes members less likely to have any loyalty to the institution because they're not rewarded for channeling their energy and ambition into their committee work. They're rewarded for channeling into like Twitter or X or whatever it's called now and cable news, right? We've turned Congress functionally into a green room for Fox News and MSNBC.
So Philip Wallach, he plotted sort of two axes of change over the past 100 years. You talked about one of them, which is the sort of committee versus leadership one.
So he agrees with me. Well, he wrote a whole book saying that he agrees with my Atlantic hypothesis.
He has another point, which is the sort of there's also kind of a pendulum which you've seen over the course of the 20th and 21st century of Congress investing in itself and the like level of professionalization where you had basically like no staff to lots of staff and then less staff, and the sort of limitations that you see now with budgets and the challenges you have in retaining people because of the amounts you guys can pay committee members.
Yeah. I think that's true. A recent example is in the 90s, one of the Gingrich reforms was to get rid of the Office of Technical Assessment.
Yep.
We tried to revive that. We had a vote on that, I want to say 2 years ago. It didn't go anywhere, but that's one example of, I think, the trend that Wallach points out. I would offer a third axis too, or maybe it's a subset of one of these, which is there's a divide within Congress that most people don't understand, which is the divide between authorizers and appropriators. So authorizers basically tell agencies what they can and can't do. They do sort of policy, whereas the appropriators actually give money to the agencies to do the things. Now, functionally, most authorizers don't authorize. We have many executive branch agencies that are operating in the absence of an authorization, and appropriators increasingly authorize on appropriations bills. So that divide, which dates back to the early 1800s when John Quincy Adams was a member, I think has been a source of incredible dysfunction. We combined the committees in the late 1800s and then separated them again in the 1920s, I believe. But my view is that you need to make the Appropriations Committee subcommittees on each standing committee, and then better align those committees with the executive branch agencies that they oversee. And by the way, make oversight not its own committee, but rather a subcommittee of these committees that actually do meaningful work. And then you solve the problem of members of Congress spending all their time fundraising or bashing people online because they have like a productive outlet for their efforts.
So why don't things like this happen?
That is a great question. Well, if you look at the last round of serious reform, there was a committee, a super committee, so Senate, House, on legislative reorganization in the 90s. I want to say 93. If you read sort of the postmortems of it, they conclude that none of the reforms were enacted because of existing committee chairs not wanting to give up their power. It is people that have power right now that obviously are loath to give it up. I also think there's another thing going on where Congress has sort of absolved itself of responsibility, right? So this scenario we live in now where members of Congress can blame the executive branch or write a letter to the executive branch asking them to do something that Congress theoretically has the authority to do, it's actually useful if you only care about getting reelected because you can just criticize without owning anything. So we've gotten lazy as a legislature. I would add one more thing, which is my own view is we've strayed away from the model of the citizen legislator. The sort of intent of the framers where you'd serve for a season and then you'd go home is no longer the norm. Now politics has become a career and fundraising has become the overwhelming activity in that career. And the only thing I can think of to fix that is term limits. And I know people have divided views on that, but I think it would actually help.
Big structural reform. You're a student of the 40s and 50s, and sort of to do that round of strategic competition, you had lots of new organizations created in the executive branch.
Yeah.
Over the past few years, we've had Office of Strategic Capital, CHIPS Act, NSF TIP, not nothing, but not creating the CIA.
Yeah.
Is there the need for that level of thinking of, moving stuff around and creating new authorities, or is that sort of too big for the moment? Or does the executive branch need that, fundamental restructuring that you think Congress needs?
I think there's room for it. Before I did the China committee or the CCP committee, I chaired this cyberspace solarium commission with Senator Angus King, who's a great American. And we created the Office of the National Cyber Director, which was motivated by that, which is here's this huge problem. Authority for it is diffused across multiple federal agencies. There's no single, to quote Angus King's favorite phrase, there's no single throat to choke. And this would be a throat to choke that is, a part of the executive office of the president, but also Senate confirmed, so therefore accountable to Congress. I imagine you could do that in other areas, particularly on sort of the economic statecraft side of the equation where, you have so many different players, right? You have Treasury, you have Commerce, you have BIS, you have all these agencies doing their own things. And oftentimes I'm not convinced they're on the same page. I mean, and particularly not aligned with other sort of hard power agencies. I think one of the stories of the Trump administration was there was this persistent divide between Treasury and between defense and NSC. There's a similar divide, I think, in the Biden administration, though it's along a slightly different axis. So yeah, I think the time has come for that. I guess one tiny little subset of that I think is actually the most important is on the hard power side of the equation. The military, I think, needs to completely streamline its bureaucracy. I think it's far past time for a hard look at Goldwater Nichols. This emphasis on jointness, the well-intentioned that came about in the 80s has now, I think, become a hindrance to actual effective operation. The Pentagon could actually take the lead on reimagining its own bureaucracy, eliminating waste while also enhancing support to the warfighter.
On that, let me give you my little critique of the select committee. My sense is that there is a power law distribution to the impact that legislation could have on strategic competition, where certain things are going to be, 100 or 1,000 times more important. And, we just talked about, very big dreams, which are probably much more difficult to accomplish than fisheries or land purchasing or outbound investment.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, how you think about allocating your time and attention with the understanding that, obviously bigger stuff is harder and less likely to happen.
Sure.
But that could be things that could really tip the scale over a decadal horizon in a way that fisheries might not.
Sure. I take that. I think that's a thoughtful critique. I spent a lot of time thinking about the mission we were given by the speaker and the minority leader, because I do think McCarthy and Jeffries set the tone early on, and they wanted this to be a serious bipartisan effort. And I interpret it as having kind of two main parts. One is a pure communications function, right? A lot of what we do or try to do is just to communicate to our colleagues and the American people why any of this matters. But the second thing is to actually, in divided government, where we have narrow control of the House, where nobody's going to be advancing a super ambitious policy agenda, identify where's the bipartisan center of gravity. And so, yeah, if you look at our first two policy reports, and hopefully there'll be a third coming out soon, maybe these aren't the home runs or the grand slams, but you start to string together enough singles and doubles. I mean, that's a meaningful impact that we can make in the 118th Congress. And I feel strongly that we shouldn't just throw up our hands and await the coming of some messianic presidential figure who's going to solve it out. Now, that being said, if you conceive of our grand strategy against China as having kind of three lines of effort, I mean, if it exists at all in a conscious way, like there's military competition, hard power, there's economic statecraft, and then there's ideological competition. I should disclose my bias. I do think the hard power stuff is most important, right? Like if you don't get the fundamental like balance of hard power across the Taiwan Strait correct, and more broadly in the Indo-Pacific, I think we're going to be struggling on economic statecraft and on ideological competition. Now, people can disagree with that. That's just the lens that's the prior I bring to this. That there is where I do think you need leadership from the executive branch. And having just given a like big old, defense of why Article 1 needs to be stronger, like it pains me to admit that we need the president to empower a Secretary of Defense to like actually like force Congress and the defense industrial base into rebuilding in a once in a generation style our munitions industrial base and our stockpile of critical munitions west of the international date line. And without that aggressive, energetic effort from the SecDef empowered by the president, a la Lehman with the 600-ship Navy, a la Gates with the MRAP, who had to fight the bureaucracy. Like he talks about this as the biggest fight he did was against the own Pentagon bureaucracy. It's going to be hard for a member of Congress or a group of members of Congress to do it on their own and foist it on the executive branch, if that makes sense. If we can figure out the kind of the short-term policy bipartisan wins, like the things we can do in the 118th Congress, my hope is that we can use the committee next year to have that conversation about, okay, in the midterm and longer term, what are the biggest things the country needs to do? Now, we're not going to be able to legislate in this Congress, but we could start to provoke a debate and a discussion on it, or even just the most fundamental questions that are unanswered. Like, what is our goal with respect to China? Like, I don't think that's a debate that's been had. The old Cold War, containment was the goal. People argued over variants of containment, but at least there was sort of like a sense of the end state. We don't have that now.
A lot to pick up on.
Sorry.
No, it's great. We're going to start with my partisan.
How frustrating is it for you, who speaks the language and actually knows things, to like have to entertain me as just a recovering Arabist now in charge of the China portfolio?
Okay, we'll do that. Having talked to a lot of recovering Arabists who are trying to say something about China, like you actually have like enough humility and have done enough of the homework. I mean, come on, you got the organizational weapon on your.
I do like to read.
Keg over there. There don't seem to be that many of you. I don't know, like the sort of like scholar soldier thing is like a rare breed, and very few of them seem to end up in Congress.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I think my path was pretty circuitous, right? Like, and I'm not trying to be like, oh shucks, Mr. Smith goes to Washington. Like I stumbled into Congress. Like, I'm driven in a lot of ways, but I think it's fair to say I was not, at least for the first decade of my career, in the Marine Corps, and then like using my GI Bill to get my PhD, and like working on the Hill as a staffer. Like I was not like pursuing a political career. I was very much trying, to the extent I was trying to shape it, was to have like the warrior scholar model in mind. And I had a lot of great mentors like H.R. McMaster, David Petraeus, who like exemplified that. And I would not have pursued my PhD were not for that. And though I'm not like advocating one should waste time and money on a PhD, I do think it forced me to think through this stuff.
Sure.
Like in a more deliberate way.
So like you, in your thesis, you brought up this ideal. I know, sorry.
Not even my dissertation committee read the thesis.
This is my job. This is what you guys all pay me for. This idea of conceptual complexity, and you sort of applied it mostly to presidents, and that's how it's kind of done in the literature. But I think you can absolutely do the same thing for legislators.
Yeah.
And it seems to me like you're probably pretty far on one side of the spectrum, and the way you characterize the incentives of the sort of machine that spits out senators and congresspeople at this point, like brings folks who are more maybe on the other side, or incents them at least to portray themselves as
Yes, but if I remember the literature, like it's important to recognize that conceptual complexity is not a measure of like smart versus dumb, hedgehog versus fox, right? Like you see the world in shades of gray versus like black and white, and it's actually useful in a lot of high pressure situations to be conceptually simple or to have a heuristic that allows you to deal with the complexity. Otherwise, you're completely parallel.
My idea is like, sure, you're a president, it's a crisis, you gotta bomb or not bomb. You want that simplicity, but like if you're a congressperson and your job is to go negotiate and find a middle ground and trade off this and that thing, like it seems like you'd really want people that are pretty far on the other side, and I don't see a lot of them, at least on my television.
When I first came into Congress 7 years ago now, I thought like the problem was just like the people. It was all people that were dumb or corrupt or careerist. And of course there are those people, right? But I think it has always been that way. There's a lot of very talented people. There's a lot of very smart people. To bring it back to I think the initial topic, I think the problem is when good people meet bad process and they get disillusioned, or they then change their way of operating to respond to rational incentives, right? I think that like what gets you on television is not going out there and being like, it's really complicated. What gets you on television is like being very bombastic and offering a black and white view of the world.
How do you fix that?
I'm trying to remember what were the three things I offered in my Atlantic piece. One was the committee reorganization, fixing the divide between authorizing and approves. The other was just changing the schedule. Like the schedule makes absolutely no sense here. Like our work schedule is crazy. Just by fixing the calendar and then aligning the fiscal year with the regular year, there's like a bunch of little tweaks like that could make this a more productive place to work. I suspect there's probably some political reforms up like that influence how people get here in the first place that you would need. Some sort of grand bargain on term limits for some campaign finance thing, whether it's you can only donate to someone you can vote for, or you can't campaign while Congress is in session. That to me makes sense as well.
Learning about how the world works as an intelligence officer versus spending time in the archives? Like what can each one of those teach you, and what can't the other teach you?
Why I had this sort of formative experience in Iraq where we were like looking for this bad guy for a while, and we thought we knew exactly where he was on various occasions and couldn't find him. And it turns out like we, through a source of eyes, were able to find him hiding inside of a couch, which to me was just like this lesson in like, even at like the tip of the spear in an area where we felt like we knew everything that was going on, and like we didn't have to worry about these big sort of geopolitical problems. It was all about like the tribal politics of the Mahalawi tribe versus the Karbuli tribe and things like that. Like it still was very messy, and like the fog of war was very, very high. And so I think it gave me a basic sense of humility, and I try and apply like what I call the Lance Corporal test now, which is as we're making these big decisions in DC, like try to think through when it's translated to the tip of the spear, like the complexities and the unintended consequences. Mental models from Eisenhower. I do think just a basic respect for decision-making process, Eisenhower was exceptional at. He attended almost every single National Security Council discussion. Obviously, the solarium exercise, which I wrote a chapter on, is like, famous now for how deliberate and rigorous it was. And his ability to sort of force debate and productive dissent. I think a basic appreciation for prioritization and how necessary it is at the level of grand strategy. And if you just like read Eisenhower, there's this constant tension between the investments necessary to defend the American way of life, and he thought about it very much as a way of life and sort of like a spiritual thing as much as it was a physical territory. And what that would do to America and over the long term, and whether it would fundamentally alter America because of those investments and because of the demands of the Cold War. I do think, and I try to be honest about this, I think because I've spent so much time thinking about like late 40s and 50s, there's a tendency for me to see parallels in the present day. So I try not to overstate that. And I know like people argue over this phrasing of whether we're in a new Cold War, but I find the analogy useful both for the similarities it illustrates as well as the difference it illustrates. And there are obviously very real differences. The communist China is not, Soviet Russia.
Yeah. Let's stay on Eisenhower for another second. When he set up the, learning from your chapter, when he set up the solarium, I gotta make fun of you more during this.
I cannot believe you read that.
I don't have a real job. This is the whole thing. He sort of bounded what could be debated.
Yeah.
And sort of said, these are the facts, and we're going to engage with them and go from there.
Yeah.
And I think something that is like very broken about America, and maybe was slightly less broken in the 40s and 50s, was the sort of appreciation of facts as they were. And like, then you could have a debate about a tighter range of like more relevant things than like, is the sky blue? Thoughts on how that maybe does or doesn't apply today?
I think I take your point, right? One thing I said, particularly in some of the brutal debates we've had over like the last election and some of the more divisive things politically in recent years, is that it's not even like we're having an ideological debate. We're having like an epistemological debate, like about like what's true and what isn't. And obviously I think that's related to like the fracturing of the media, right? I mean, in Eisenhower's day, there was, only a few sources of information. I think most people trusted, the one of the two newspapers that were available, or one of the 4 channels that were available. No such situation exists right now. So
and the thing is, like, people were very wrong too then also, right? Like, people thought Stalin was great. People thought Mao was doing a good job. So there were things of distinct, you could all agree about something and still be really wrong.
Totally. People thought,
missile gap. I mean, come on.
No one conceived in 1950 that the North Koreans would invade the South, right? Or that China would then become involved later on. Yeah, there was a missile gap, but it was in our favor, and obviously Kennedy campaigned on that. Yeah, so I mean, there's definite trade-offs. So, which is why people should just opt into the ChinaTalk view of the world and only get their information from your podcast and your Substack, and then we can all agree on the bounds of the debate. There is, however, this debate that persists today about whether Eisenhower rigged the game, right? Whether he went into the exercise basically already having decided on a sort of version of what was Task Force A under George Kennan, Great Wisconsinites leadership, combined sprinkling a little bit of B and C on top of it, but kind of rigged the game in favor of his preferred strategy. And I think that's a conclusion that probably most notably Richard Immerman, who wrote with Robert Bowie, Waging Peace, How Eisenhower Forged an Enduring Cold War Strategy, and a classic article called Confessions of an Eisenhower Revisionist, an agonizing reappraisal, would put it. I kind of slightly disagree with it, but I mean, that's the debate rages on.
And that is the critique that some would give you and many of your colleagues who would say that, look, you're sort of the bounds in which you're willing to kind of like cut China, interrogate versus not interrogate are maybe more narrow than they should be.
I think there's a shared bipartisan recognition that the CCP, no, there's not even a recognition that the CCP is our greatest threat, right? I think there's a meaningful number of Democrats who would say climate change is our greatest threat. So I think, this is the argument that who's made this since the start of our committee, like who attacked someone attacked us for being too bipartisan, like, and groupthink, a bunch of prominent people, but like there's a lot of meaningful disagreements happening on the committee, right? And even within the parties, right? There's dramatically different views between me and members of the Financial Services Committee on how to get outbound. Right. There are different views on, overall in the relative prioritization of climate change. There's obviously disagreement between me and the Biden administration on engagement and whether it's useful right now. And then I think there's debates probably more in your community, or like more like debates that are being had in sort of the outside think tank community more than in Congress on what exactly is China's ambition. Right? Like, is it just regional dominance? Is it global dominance? What do they mean? What does global dominance mean? Are they trying to reshape the system? Are they actively trying to destroy us? Are they trying to get us to commit physician-assisted suicide? Like, this is the debate in Doshi's book and Ian Easton's book, and who would represent the more like the best version of China has a more restrained ambitions. I don't even know who that would be.
So there's
debate over whether or not Xi Jinping is serious when he says, I'm going to take Taiwan by force if necessary. There's a debate about the timing for that. And then the biggest divide, I think, is between the financial community and the national security community. And in some cases, that divide is bigger than the divide between me and my ranking member on a lot of issues.
The strategic shocks versus sort of solarium considered development. I think we have a horrific case study happening right now in Israel where you have had a horrific attack, which is, I think if you could press pause on time and think for 3 months about all the different options that you would take to deal with the problem, like that would be great, but that's not going to happen because they live in a democracy and are going to have to make decisions. We only have 5 minutes, so I'm not going to ask you to talk about Israel, but I could see a similar thing happening in a Trump, DeSantis, or God forbid, Vivek 2025 administration, where a blockade happens, a bombing happens, and all of a sudden there's going to have to be a decision point of like whether or not it's worth it
for Taiwan.
For Taiwan,
yeah.
You worried about that? Like you mentioned, the sort of isolationism threat earlier. What does America need to do to think through the trade-offs of that?
Well, I guess in the more immediate, I'm worried. This is sort of like bizarre parallels to like 2014, 2015, where we had tried to extricate ourselves from the Middle East, and chaos ensued, and therefore we had kind of the first failed pivot to the Pacific. And I think sort of the idea of the pivot is flawed. This idea that we can sort of neatly sort of pick up our investment in one region of the world and focus on the Indo-Pacific. I know I'm simplifying it. I know like smart people like Kirk Campbell and otherwise would reject that characterization. But the point is we have interest in the Middle East that we're going to have to defend and advance. And we have interest in the Indo-Pacific. And I do think the Indo-Pacific is our priority theater. But I worry that in bizarrely similar ways, i.e. Biden comes in trying to resuscitate the lifeless corpse of the Iran nuclear deal, misunderstands the basic alliance structure, underestimates the lengths to which Iran would go to screw up any rapprochement between Israel and the Sunni Arab Gulf states, Saudi Arabia in particular. Now we're going to be dealing with regional chaos that's going to consume so much of our time and energy that we may not put in place a deterrence by denial posture in the next 3 years that would make an invasion less likely, if that makes sense. But to the thrust of your question, yeah, I do worry. And I feel like my job on this committee is to make the case that defending Taiwan matters, or helping Taiwan defend itself. But certainly if China were to attack Taiwan, I would make the argument that we have an interest in helping repel that invasion.
How much can you really solarium your way into sort of like setting the deck, putting the cards in the right way in the deck so that when your strategic shock comes, you end up, choosing the right path?
Well, I don't think we need to solarium our way into it. Like, we don't need to have some like prolonged 6-month debate about the best path forward. Like, I suspect you could lock me, Bridge Colby and Eli Ratner in a room, and we would come up with like.
I guess because this is not a strategic surprise, because this is something
we know. What we have to do is just surge the right type of hard power to the Indo-Pacific and to the first island chain in particular, to make it like a fundamentally unpalatable military proposition for Xi Jinping. Like, that is the thing we must do, like within the next 5 years before it's too late.
Last thing, how do you think you've improved in this role, and like where do you want to keep working on or get better at, or what skills did you wish you had?
I wish I were better at speaking extemporaneously, and I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and that's going to be a skill I have. But I have to like write things out and think about them to pretend like I know what I'm doing. As much as I crapped on the like soundbite culture and like how TV rewards sort of the black and white analysis, you do have to do it. Like, and I think I've grudgingly accepted the fact that in order to be successful, I have to engage on TV, particularly whenever I can do it with my ranking member. I think it sends a powerful message. So like, I'm naturally built as an introvert, and I'm naturally like wired to just like read books and write things. But like, getting comfortable with the external facing part of the job is something I've accepted and I'm trying to get better at.
Well, ChinaTalk is welcome to help you practice and get your way.
I love this. I love this conversation. I have to make, since you referenced cognitive complexity, I have to confess, I actually think like the measurement of it is totally bogus. Like the way.
Oh yeah, I saw there were like 100. I saw the footnotes that like there are 114 things. I'm like, this is completely bullshit. But the idea is like
They measure the if I remember, like the transcripts of like interviews, like non-scripted answers, and
Like
they
how many
code
commas
it.
they had in the
Yeah, they
sentences or
code
some
it.
shit?
Which
Oh my
and even part of what I did in that is problematize the measurement of foreign policy experience, which is easier to measure. But like Truman rates historically low, even though like
he fought.
he led, he did the Truman Commission, which was a great book that just came out by Steve Drummond, which I'm passing out to everybody, which is about the Truman Commission, which was the reason he became vice president. And so actually with a more accurate measurement, he becomes like a higher level scoring president. I do think experience matters. On the other hand, in the course of that, I gained a respect for prospect theory. Like I think prospect theory is actually useful and helps understand decision-making in a useful way that isn't overly simplistic.
Well, you said Selznick was too hard for you. So
It's too hard.
aside from a ChinaTalk mug, we also have Elting Morrison's Men, Machines, and Modern Times.
Whoa.
I don't know if you come across this before.
No, but it's small enough.
I know
where
it's
I feel
really
like
small. It's beautifully written, and it explores case studies of how technological change, how bureaucracies responded to technological change. And
This is like right up my alley. I love it. Okay, I have to give you a copy of Drummond's book in return.
we have a rule, ChinaTalk, we only take gifts $5 or below. So.
Okay, so I can't give that to you. Sorry.
work
You can look at it. You can admire it on your way out. But thank you so much.
Mike Gallagher,
Appreciate it.
thanks so much for being part of ChinaTalk.
Thanks.
Okay.